So this here is the Intel Xeon 3475X Testbench. And the interesting thing about this CPU is that it can be overclocked. Intel leaves quite a lot of performance on the table, but the question is how much, and is it worth doing? This is really a workstation CPU, right? Overclocking is really known as enthusiastic thing. You're tuning your CPU that out of spec, out of the factory spec. So to be able to do that on a professional platform, that raises a lot of questions to me. Like, how much performance do we get? Why didn't Intel do it from the factory? Is it worth it? How much performance are we going to gain? What downsides are there? Well, that's what we're going to be talking about.
Looking for a cheap way to license your Windows? Check out Hookeys through the links in the video description. Make sure to use the code TN20 to get a 30% off. Paste the license to the activation settings and you're all done. This license is for Windows 10, but you can upgrade it to Windows 11 for free. They also offer Microsoft Office 19 license. Use the same code TN20 to get a 30% off. Check out Hookeys.com in the video description below.
So let's talk about the good news first, and then I'll leave the bad news secondly. The good news is that, obviously you can do overclocking even with an air cooler. This is the Noctua NHU14S for this LGA 4677 socket, and you can even do some overclocking with an air cooler. It's completely fine. The interesting thing is, at stock, this CPU is already pulling 400 watts. You can increase it and be completely fine with this air cooler as well. And if you just want to flick on the speed optimization in Intel XDU software, which is pretty much one-click overclock, you can completely do this with this cooler, and then it's going to increase it from 400 to 450 watts around there. And there's no problem cooling it. It's completely fine. Even having an air cooler for this overclocking is completely fine. You can fine tune these settings as much as you can, and I'm not by any means professional overclocker. I want to explore this from a creator's point of view. How much performance are we getting? Is it even doable with the hardware I have? And the answer is yes. And if we're looking at the Cinebench performance increase, then you can see that from stock settings, which still means, multi-core enhancement is enabled from BIOS, to Speed Optimizer 2.0 from XDU, we're gaining about 1% in single core performance in Cinebench and about 12% in the multi-core score. So 12% is quite a lot for just one-click multi-core performance. Sometimes there is 12% between CPUs or different model of CPUs. So to be able to get that from whatever CPU you have is quite impressive. But then you can manually dial in some settings and get this CPU to go past 720 watts. I mean, I was testing this, and go have a look at this cooler review for this and how we air cooled over 700 watts on this CPU. But I was using the Phantix 1000 watt amp power supply, as you can see here. This power supply on its own is getting close to the limit of supporting the power to the CPU. I mean, we're pushing the limit of these two 8-pin EPS power connectors for the CPU. That's how much power we can easily pull there, and it's borderline coolable with this air cooler, depending on your ambient temperature and the airflow and so on. But then you can get something like this. This is the Enermax LigTech 2 360mm AIO, and this is a very special cooler because the actual cooler plate on the AIO is covering the whole IHS of the big CPU of this Xeon in there, and that's a huge benefit compared to normal AIOs that you see on the mainstream for the small CPUs, right? And because of that, it has a lot of cooling capabilities. I mean, on the box it says here 500 watt plus TDP overclocking support, and I was able to cool this CPU down past 720 watts. I think at some point we were pushing close to 800 and 760, something like that, 780 watts, and then we saw some cause thermal throttle. If I would have had better fans, perhaps I would have still been able to do that, but it's still absolutely amazing to do with this. So just in perspective, if we overclock the cores to about 3.9 to 4 gigahertz at all cores, compared to the 3 gigahertz that they're running at stock. So we're getting extra gigahertz added there. We're getting a multi-core score of 65,000 points. Now, I was getting past that as well, 66 and 67, and if someone would fine-tune it, they could probably get close to 70,000 points, which means that this CPU with 36 cores gets close to the AMD Threadripper Pro 5995WX 64-core GPU, which is the best Threadripper platform CPU that AMD offers right now. Obviously, at about 3 times the wattage, maybe not that much, but more than double, 2.5, 3 times, something like that, the wattage. But there is the overclocking capabilities there. And I wasn't doing a custom loop. If someone wants to do a custom loop in there, there's probably even more performance in store for that. So those of you who are interested in overclocking, it's completely doable. And some of the cores you can push past 5 gigahertz and it's there. Which brings me to a question: why is Intel letting you do that, first of all? And why aren't they doing it from stock, from the factory, right? With overclocking, we're introducing this variable of instability into the equation. Overclocking is past the spec, and even though you can get more performance, you never know when the overclock is going to fail and you're going to lose your performance. Or you're going to get a blue screen of death, black screen of death, the platform's unstable anymore. So for creators, I never recommend overclocking just because it's really not worth it. It's worth it until you have your first crash and you lose your project or you lose your workflow, and then you're thinking, oh my word, I'd rather have it about 25% slower, but at least I didn't crash. In a moment, we're going to see some benchmarks, but I benchmarked it with the one-click speed optimizer, which pushes it to 450 watts, and that's completely doable with air cooler, because I thought that if we are pushing it to 700 watts, yes, it's cool to have a single, maybe Cinebench R23 score or something like that, but in general, I'm not sure people would be actually using it in that type of capacity. Now, my guess why Intel has done it this way and hasn't overclocked it from the factory is probably to be more competitive or look more competitive compared to AMD and what AMD is doing on their Threadripper CPUs, because the base TDP is much lower on the Threadrippers compared to this Xeons. The Xeons are much more power hungry. And power hungry doesn't mean that it's hotter, because 400 watts and 280 watts, that looks like double the, heat or whatever. But actually, the temperatures are very, very controllable on the Xeon. It's completely fine. So I'm going to leave the Testbench setup in the description below if you want to check it out. By the way, thanks Kingston for sending out this Kingston Fury Renegade Pro kit, 128 gigabytes, DDR5, 6,000 mega transfers per second, 8 channels on this platform. So in Geekbench, with overclock, we're actually losing about 2.8% in the single core performance, but gaining about 7% in the multi-core performance. Bear in mind, Geekbench doesn't count the threads in this benchmark, but only cores. But because all of the cores have 2 threads, we're not actually utilizing the threads in this application. Moving on to Blender though, interestingly, we're gaining quite a bit of performance. In Monster Scene, we are gaining about 14.6%, in Jug Shop Scene about 12.5%, but in Classroom Scene, interestingly, we're losing about 13.7%. So as you can see, with overclock, sometimes the performance isn't increased, it can also lose performance. Obviously, if you manually tune all of them, it might be a little bit different. In Photoshop, we're actually slower in overall score, about 3.9%. In GPU score, we're actually 4% faster, even though we're using the same GPU, the same system. In general score, we're about 6.7% slower, and filter score is about the same. So not that much of a difference in Photoshop. In Lightroom Classic, the overall score has increased about 1.1%, and the active score about 2%, and passive score about 0.8%. I'd say, again, probably not worth the overclock unless you're tuning in something manually and going absolutely balls to the wall overclock. In Premiere Pro, very interestingly, we're actually losing quite a bit of performance. The GPU and effects score are slightly faster, but the rest of them are measurably smaller. Standard overall score about 10.5% slower and extended overall score 5.9% slower. So perhaps the speed optimizer can't push the single cores as high anymore, and we're not getting the single threaded performance as fast. No, there's some kind of delay or lag, but in Premiere Pro, we're not getting the performance increase that we're looking for. But in After Effects, things are slightly different. Overall score is 6.3% faster, but the multi-core score is 33.3% faster. That is a huge increase. In After Effects, if you're doing a lot of rendering, then having a big Xeon or Threadripper CPU might make a ton of sense, especially if you have this one and get 33% performance. That's quite good. The GPU score, interestingly, has gone lower. RAM preview is slightly faster as well, and the render score as well as the tracking score. So in After Effects, the one-click overclock kind of makes sense. Moving on to DaVinci Resolve, here we can see that the extended and standard overall score have increased just a little bit, 2.6 and 3.6%. The 4K and 8K media score a little bit more, 6.1 and 7.3% increase, but the GPU effects and fusion scores have pretty much stayed the same and not massive increase in there. So I'd say unless you're doing something specific in After Effects where multi-core rendering makes sense, then the OC, you might want to flick that on after you've done the whole project and you've saved the project and you're rendering out. Maybe that makes sense, but actively working on the project, I don't see the point in there. Lastly, let's have a look at V-Ray, and here we see considerable increase. With overclock, we're getting 11.4% increase in performance, which is quite nice with just one click and no hassle increase and not changing any of the hardware, not fiddling around. So it kind of makes sense. So in conclusion, what would I say? I'd say if you're a creative professional, I'd probably not overclock the CPU. It's probably not worth it, but if you like tinkering around and playing around with it, it's quite an interesting field because Intel is sitting on a ton of performance. With just this AIO, for example, I was able to add 1 gigahertz to these cores, which is ridiculous performance increase. I mean, when were you able to just literally dial in a little bit of core voltage offset plus 0.1 volts and then add 1 gigahertz to all of the cores and get ridiculous performance increase? When did you get that on your mainstream CPUs? I mean, that's really unheard of. So these CPUs have a ton of overclocking potential. Now, I'm not an overclocking professional, and I would love to see what someone can do with this, with perhaps a custom loop and where we can get even more cooling out of this. Perhaps we can pull about 1000 watts from the socket. I'm not sure, but it's interesting, yet not worth it, and still makes me scratch my head. Why was Intel doing this? I guess it just leaves a little bit of a playroom for those who want to, but even though it's still made for creative professionals. But hey, if you're a creative professional and you want to save money building a PC, then check out the build guides in the video description below. There's 4 videos there. Pick the one that's closest to your budget and build yourself a PC. I'll explain everything down there. And the prices have actually come down, which means that you can get those PCs even cheaper. So I highly recommend check them out. Thanks guys for watching, and I'll see you soon. Bye bye.